In this part of the section this week, we will focus on whether culture is actually a uniquely human attribute or whether other animals also have features of culture. This is actually a very complex question. Science ran a feature a few years ago on the most complex questions in the sciences, and there were a couple of questions that were directly relevant to exactly this issue. So, understanding what are the roots of human culture, because obviously no other animal has culture the way we have, yet a lot of animals seem to have some rudiments of culture. So, where does it actually come from? And also, what are the evolutionary roots of other cultural traits such as language or music? So this is one of those great puzzles, and even though that special feature was published in 2005, these debates are still raging in the literature. So in this section we are going to look at definitions of culture, we will look at some cultural traditions in animal societies, we will look at the concept of cumulative culture and some experimental mechanisms related to that, and think about how human cumulative culture is potentially different from animals and their forms of culture. So what is culture? This is probably one of the most debated questions in areas like anthropology, but also parts of sociology and psychology. Faulkner and Baldwin, Lindsley and Hecht in 2006, they summarized definitions of culture across the social sciences. This is actually something that Kroeber and Kluckhohn in the 1950s, right at the beginning of the scientific study of culture and anthropology, they identified a mind-boggling number of definitions of culture, and that of course over the years has only increased. But Faulkner and colleagues, they were able to come up with a couple of clusters. So we have definitions around structure, pattern, so what actually includes culture, what is it? There are definitions around what is the function of a culture, so how does a culture work, how does it why does it do the things it does, and how does it work. There are definitions focusing on the process, how does culture achieve its functions. There are definitions focusing on products, so typically cultural artifacts. There are definitions of culture focusing on refinement or cultivation, so the French notion of civilization. And then obviously there are also a lot of definitions on or about culture as related to power and ideology. Adam Cohen, a couple years later, tried to redefine culture for psychological purposes, and he essentially came up with very similar concepts again, related to meaning systems. So this is kind of a structure or pattern explanation, and informations, like being passed on. Right. So most of the definitions in psychology, therefore, focus on these three different clusters of culture definitions. In evolutionary research, people take a slightly different approach. I say slightly because it is in many ways compatible with how culture has been defined in psychology or anthropology in many ways. So, for example, here from Boyd and Richardson, culture is information, so therefore it's related to the structure or pattern definitions that is capable of affecting individuals' phenotypes. So this is one of the differences that these definitions take, which they require from other conspecifics by teaching or imitation. So this is related to process definitions of culture. So you can see it's a conglomeration of different definitions that are common in psychology, or looking at Dean, or inspired by work by Leyland and others. It's group typical behavior patterns shared by members of a community that rely on socially learned and transmitted information. So in a way, it's following the similar kind of pattern, focusing on culture, or shared traits within a specific community that need to be transmitted socially, so there's learning involved. And probably a major difference between evolutionary researchers and psychologists investigating culture is probably that more emphasis is being paid to information for survival, so information to produce tools to produce behavior that is adaptive in a specific context. So that's probably the major distinction. So now the interesting question is, to what extent are cultural traits or features, to what extent can we actually identify those in animal societies? And this is something that there has been a lot of research recently showing that a lot of animals show very interesting features of culture that we have missed because we have taken a very human-centered view on culture so far. So here is a study that I really like. It was published in Nature a few years ago by Lucy Aplin and colleagues, focusing on a small bird, the gray tit, which is very common in large parts of Europe, and you can also find it in New Zealand. And so what they did, it was a very smart experiment. Let me show you. So they had two different options of how an animal could get to some food. Right? So you had these apparatus, and there was a slider, and the slider in a training setting would need to be pushed either to the left or to the right. And so animals had to learn this behavior pattern, and in the wild, right? So different bird groups dispersed in a large forest were exposed to a variation of this mechanism and were trained to either shift the lever to the left and then get some food, or shift it to the right and then get some food. And now after that, after this kind of training phase, they now put the same apparatus into the wild, but now the lever could be pushed in either direction. So either behavior would now give you food. Right? So in this kind of observational stage after the training, you would have these birds, and they now can freely interact with the apparatus. It would open, birds can open it, get some food and get out again. Importantly, now the slider can be moved in both directions, and the important question is to what extent animals would actually still use the same strategy that they had learned previously, and whether other animals that were not trained now start picking up the same behavior. Right? So for them, actually, it would be quite useful to just play around with it and see whether if you look at this, if I would come from the other side, I could actually push that little bird away now if I would come from the other side, rather than having to wait and trying to challenge that bird, to get it away from that particular position, right? So the question now is, to what extent are these completely arbitrary behaviors, are they maintained in a population, and other birds are actually learning that over time? And so what you can see here is there's one group that was not trained at all in green here, so the control group, and here is the proportion of solvers in the population. And as you can see, the shift to the right, which is option I think option A, and the shift to the left, which is option B, remains relatively stable in these bird populations. And so after, in the experimental phase at time 2, what you can see is the behavioral strategy remains stable in each population depending on what was first taught to these animals or not. And the really exciting thing is this innovation spread through the network. So these birds now started copying each other, and importantly would copy the information from birds in their group, or as they moved, and once they had learned this, and as they moved to a new environment where the researchers had put this experimental apparatus, they would now teach other birds, or other birds would observe them, how to open this this apparatus in order to get some food. Right? And so over time what happens is these behavioral norms would spread through populations and would be maintained, even though they're completely arbitrary, would be maintained in populations over time. So this is social transmission. It differentiates groups from each other, and it's information. So it fits all the definitions of culture according to these definitions by both psychologists and evolutionary researchers. So the question is this actually an isolated case? Let's have a look at another famous example here.
The inlets echo to the sound of a mysterious song. A curtain of bubbles and a haunting call hold the secret to an ingenious way of fishing. This is bubble net feeding. A dozen whales work together to harvest the herring bonanza. Such fishing requires an extraordinary level of intelligence and cooperation. The lead whale dives first. She is the bubble blower. It's her job to find the fish. The rest follow in formation. Each takes exactly the same position in every lunge. Once she's located the fish, the leader blows a net of bubbles that completely encircles the shoal. Another whale calls to synchronize the group. Panicked by the eerie sound and the blinding bubbles, the fish won't cross this fizzing curtain. As few as 100 humpbacks have learned how to feed as a team like this. And this is the only place on the planet where whales fish in this way.
Alright, pretty amazing stuff. And what we now know is that species like humpback whales have a number of different techniques. So there are other techniques where they use, instead of blowing the bubbles, they may use their tails to create bubbles. And again, this has been shown to spread through communities and being passed on from one generation to the next. Again, very clearly showing that there's cultural diffusion and cultural traditions with within specific groups. And even more exciting, very recently, well, a few years ago now, a study showed for the first time that these cultural traditions within animals like whales, or in this case killer whales, orcas, lead to follow-on genetic changes. So it's a classic example of gene culture co-evolution, where these cultural traditions set up new selection mechanisms for genetic or natural selection to work. And what they were able to show, that different feeding behaviors in different groups of orcas over time started to be associated with different body morphology, so created by different selection pressures, which now allowed them to be more well adapted to the specific requirements of the cultural tradition. Right, so it's essentially culture leading the way for genetic evolution to take place. So a classic example of gene culture coevolution, which demonstrates that it's not just humans but also other animals that have stable cultural traditions that are so stable that they allow genetic evolution to take place. So gene culture coevolution. One interesting question that I think would be really worth exploring further is to what extent these fission-fusion societies are actually more likely to lead to the development of cultural traits. There are all sorts of examples now from the animal kingdom where you have group-specific behavioral traits that are passed on across generations, and quite often it seems to be it's those groups where you have this kind of fission fusion. So in the evening everyone comes together, but during the day you have small groups of animals moving around, working together, collaborating with each other in order to get food, and then come back and in the evening to sleep. So it's an interesting hypothesis, I think, that people have also talked about in biology, and I think that would be very informative to work on further. So as a summary of this section so far, social learning and animal culture are widespread. I didn't talk about this, but there's now really strong evidence that even as simple animals as for example fish have very clear examples of social learning and social traditions, social exploration of their environment. And so it's widespread. Information typically spreads through networks, so network structures are really important for information to travel and to become disseminated, and it is very key to understand or to emphasize the role of observational learning, which we have seen in these social learning strategy tournaments. And we have even evidence of gene culture coevolution in in animal society. So really strong evidence that culture is not a unique trait, and other animals across a number of different families and taxes actually do have culture in the way that we typically define it for human societies.